Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to look at the period of time from Malachi to Matthew as we continue our introduction to our survey of the Old Testament. We start with the Persian Empire. Remember that the Persians were the empire that was in control as our Old Testament comes to an end, and within 100 years the Persian Empire itself would come crashing down. The Persian Empire was the largest empire that the world had seen up to this point, stretching from the borders of Greece in the west and taking in Egypt all the way to the Hindu Kush and to the borders of India. It was Alexander the Great, this young king who came to the throne in his early 20s, who would, within the space of 10 years, bring the Persian Empire to an end. There's a mosaic that was found in the ruins of Pompeii today. It's in the Naples Museum, and it pictures the epic battle of Alexander against King Darius of Persia. It was 3 such battles that cumulative, he won each one of those, and at the end of that time, the Persian Empire had come to an end. Josephus tells one story about Alexander as he was marching down the Levant. Each city to which he would come would open their doors. He would come in. He'd say, "Recognize me as king, and you can go about your business." And nearly every city did that. Tyre was a notable exception. And he was besieging Gaza and sent some troops up to Jerusalem. And the doors were shut in their face. They were not allowed to enter the city, and of course that meant that from Alexander's point of view, he was going to destroy the city. And so Josephus tells the story about how Alexander sent some troops to besiege and capture Jerusalem and slaughter the inhabitants. And the high priest of the city went out with a number of the other priests to meet him as he came up to Jerusalem. And Josephus said they had with them a copy of the book of Daniel. And when the book of Daniel was showed him, that it was showed to Alexander, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that he himself was the person intended, and he was then glad. And so Alexander was so impressed by this that the Hebrew scriptures talked about a Greek king who would conquer Persia, that he said, well, you guys can go ahead about your business. And he gave he treated the Jews well and gave them a certain amount of autonomy. Of course, they had to pay taxes to him, but that was par for the course. Alexander continues on into Egypt. In Egypt, he is crowned as the pharaoh. Even takes a trip out to the Siwa oasis, way out on the borders of Libya. It was no small affair. So here's Alexander. He's moved through Turkey, moved down through the Levant to Egypt. I mentioned he went all the way to the Siwa oasis. Egypt becomes his without any really too much in the way of fighting. Then he turns back and marches across Mesopotamia and into Persia, captures the city of Persepolis, the Persian capital, burns it to the ground. He's fought Darius now several times, and the Persian Empire is now his. But he continues on to the east to the Hindu Kush and all the way into India over the next several years, and only turns back when his men say, "Please, we don't want to go any further," and they basically revolt against him. They stage a sit-down strike, and he says, "Come on, let's go," and they won't. And finally, he agrees to turn back, and he comes back to Babylon. Now, the world of Alexander. He had brought about a cultural interchange from east to west. If you wanted to talk to Alexander, you basically had to learn his language. And so Greek now is going to become the common language of the entire civilized world. What's more, he brings a great deal of scientific interchange as he goes upon his march of conquest. He has with him scientists and observers, and remember his tutor when he was growing up had been Aristotle, and so he was well versed in science and interested in these sorts of things. Hellenization, and by this I mean, now the word Hellenization just means, we could call it Greekization, because Hellas is just the Greek word for Greece. They don't call their country Greece, we call it that. So Hellenization, that is the Greek influence, not just of the language, but of the culture now, began to be felt throughout the ancient world as a result of Alexander's conquest. As we said, the Greek language also becomes the common language. As a result, our New Testament, all of the earliest copies of our New Testament are not written in Aramaic or Hebrew, they are written in Greek. Alexander finally died. He was about 33 years old, and as he lay on his deathbed, his soldiers gathered around and asked, "To whom do you give your kingdom?" And he whispered out, "To the strongest." Leaving no male heir, this meant that there would be a power grab to see who could take what from his kingdom. There were a number of generals that each grabbed a portion. Ptolemy grabbed Egypt, Perdiccas grabbed Mesopotamia, Antigonus the One-Eyed, what we call Anatolia or modern-day Turkey, Lysimachus took Thrace, Cassander took Macedonia. But this didn't. This wasn't going to pan out as the sort of a long-term solution. Perdiccas, he comes up against Ptolemy, tries to take Egypt, and he is destroyed. And then the other kings all team up against Antigonus the One-Eyed. They march against Antigonus, they defeat him, and now this doesn't happen overnight, this is over the space of 20 or 30 years. And when the dust settles, the new ruler of Anatolia and Mesopotamia will be Seleucus. And he and his descendants, now Seleucus is one of Ptolemy's subgenerals, initially, but instead of giving the property back to Ptolemy, Seleucus sets himself up and his descendants as the new ruler. So you have Greek rulers now in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, and in, of course, Thrace and Greece. You would expect to see Greek rulers there. But these are all Greek rulers. In fact, Ptolemy, and they'll be the first, the second, the third, all the way down to the 12th. Every one of the Ptolemies will be Egyptian. The last of the Ptolemies that we shall see will be a young gal by the name of Cleopatra, but she will be Greek. And with the exception of Cleopatra, none of the Ptolemies ever even learned to speak Egyptian. They're all speaking Greek. Likewise, the Seleucids, now they won't all be named Seleucus. Sometimes we'll see another name, but it will be his descendants that will be ruling for the next 100, 150, 200 years or so. Ptolemy, the second of the Ptolemies, Ptolemy Philadelphus, is interesting to us because first of all, he builds the Pharos lighthouse, a lighthouse near Alexandria, which became one of the wonders of the world. It's said that you could see its light from 50 miles away. I'm not sure if that's accurate or not, but that's how the story is told. He also builds a library at Alexandria. I've been in the modern-day library of Alexandria and never been in the ancient one. It's long since been destroyed, and it too was one of the wonders of the world. And Ptolemy Philadelphus set out to have copies of every book in the world in his library, and one of the books that he wanted for his library was the Hebrew Scriptures. However, he couldn't read Hebrew, he couldn't even read Egyptian, and he was ruling over Egypt, and so an order went out for the Hebrew Scriptures to be translated into Greek. And that translation took place now. It's known as the Septuagint. The Septuagint means, the septus means 70. And the story goes that there were 70 translators who worked on this project. But what they did is they translated the entire Old Testament Hebrew Scriptures into Greek. And we still have copies of the Greek translation. Like I said, it's known as the Septuagint. It wasn't long before the Ptolemies and the Seleucids were at war one with another, and this was going to be the pattern for the next 100 years or so. So we have Seleucus in the north, the Ptolemies in the south, and their descendants in each case, with little tiny Israel sitting in the middle, and first Israel would be a property of the Ptolemies, and then the Seleucids would come down, and for a time Israel would be the property of the Seleucids. So you're going to have Israel feeling a little bit like a ping pong ball between these two rivals. Finally, Antiochus III, he's one of the Seleucid kings. He's also known as Antiochus the Great, because I guess it doesn't get much better than him. He marches all the way to India, just like Alexander had, stocks up on his store of war elephants, among other things, And he takes Judah from Ptolemy. As I said, it had been bouncing back and forth. But he loses in a battle to Ptolemy at the Battle of Raphia, so he is still unable to do that final conquest over Egypt. And he is host to Hannibal. Remember, Hannibal was the great enemy, not of the Ptolemies, but of Rome, which tells me that Rome is now entering the picture. And after Hannibal had lost to the Romans, Hannibal came to the east and found refuge with Antiochus III, which is not going to put him on the same side as the Romans. So Antiochus III and the Romans, they enter into battle, and Antiochus III loses to the Romans, and as a part of the loss, his son is taken as a captive back to Rome. He'll be a hostage. Now, that doesn't mean he's put into prison. He goes to school there and probably has a roommate and things like that. But his son is in Rome. Now, after Antiochus III dies, his son, Antiochus IV, he's also known as Antiochus Epiphanes, that means Antiochus the Magnificent, although the Jews had a different nickname for him. They called him Antiochus Epimanes, which meant Antiochus the Madman, and that's going to tell you his relationship with the Jewish people. Well, as we had the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and Antiochus IV, when his father dies, he escapes from Rome, and he comes back to take up the throne of the Seleucids. He's been a hostage there in Rome, but now he makes his escape, and he comes back, takes up the crown, and he decides he's going to be another Alexander. He comes down to Judah. He doesn't really care for the things that are going on in there. He says, I want a more Greek-friendly governor, and they don't really have governors so much in Judah as much as they would have a high priest. So he deposes the high priest, and he puts a high priest who will be a little bit more Greek in his thinking, which does not endear him at all to the Jews. Next, he invades Egypt. He decides, I want to be another Alexander the Great, and so I'll do what Dad could not do. I will come down against Ptolemy, and this time he comes down and he wins big. And he has Ptolemy bottled up in the last city. It's about to fall, when all of a sudden, coming out from the city is a Roman magistrate, all by himself. And Antiochus says, well, what's this? It's actually an acquaintance of his that he had met back in Rome. And this magistrate walks up to him and says, the Senate and the people of Rome want you out of Egypt. Go home. And Antiochus has actually been to Rome. He has a high regard for Rome and for the power of Rome, and so he's a bit intimidated, but he says, well, I'll tell you what, I'll think about it. And the magistrate says, you can think about all you want, draws a circle around him on the sand, and says, give me your answer before you step out of that circle. Now, Antiochus is thoroughly humiliated, but he knows better than to go up against Rome, and so he agrees to leave. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, word has gotten back that Antiochus had died in Egypt. Now, it wasn't true. It was just a false rumor. You know how you have false rumors on the internet today. They had them back then as well. And Antiochus arrives in Jerusalem, and he's very much alive. And he's angry at the Jewish celebration over his death. And he comes in and he imposes the following regulations. The Jews are no longer allowed to assemble for prayer. Observance of the Sabbath is now forbidden. Possession of the scriptures are illegal. It's illegal to even own a copy of the scriptures. Circumcision of male children is now illegal. Circumcision is illegal. And the observance to dietary laws is now illegal. In fact, Antiochus goes into the temple and has a pig killed upon the altar and orders everybody sacrifice and eat up. He has a statue of Zeus placed into the temple. In fact, and nobody knows what Zeus looks like, so those that made the statue make him look like Antiochus. It actually looks like a statue of Antiochus standing in the temple. Everybody's supposed to worship that now. These pagan sacrifices are now mandated. And this continues for a number of months until finally his officials are in a little town called Modin, and they are seeking to impose these restrictions, these pagan sacrifices, and a elderly priest, Matthias, and his sons are in that town, and they institute a revolt. We're going to call it the Maccabean Revolt, named after one of those sons. He's not the oldest, but he's the sort of the leader of the group. His name is Judas, but he gets the nickname Maccabeus because the word Maccabeus means hammer, and he really puts the hammer to the Seleucids. So the Maccabean Revolt breaks out, and finally by 166 BC they are able to retake Jerusalem, and they recapture the temple. The temple is finally liberated. It is cleansed. All the pigs are taken away, and there's a cleansing of the temple as the people return to the Lord. That celebration continues to be observed even today. We call it the Festival of Lights, or the Feast of Hanukkah. Now, Judas was the initial leader, but after he eventually dies in battle. And so it will be one of his brothers, Simon, who becomes the new leader. They're not calling themselves kings. These are a family of priests. But eventually they are going to take the role of high priest. And Judah is recognized as a free state in the year 142 BC. It's Rome that recognizes Judah at first. But eventually everybody else does. And so Judah has gained her independence. As we said, this family, Simon in particular, eventually takes the role of high priest. He's sort of the ruler. They don't really have kings yet, although eventually they're going to take the title of king as well. Simon reigns until he is murdered by his son-in-law. And we already read that. He's murdered by his son-in-law. And now we're going to see the emergence of two new Jewish parties. First of all, they are the Hasidim, the pious ones. They are reflected in those who said we wouldn't turn and worship those false gods. We wouldn't eat those things that were wrong. In fact, we don't care for the way that there's a certain Greek thinking that's beginning to seep into our culture. We're going to remain free of that. And this group will eventually become known as the Pharisees of New Testament era. So we have the Hasidim on the one side. You have what we could only call the Hellenists. Now these aren't Greeks, but they're Greek thinkers. They're Greek thinking Jews who have been influenced by that Greek thinking. And these seem to be characterized by the Sadducees of a later age. The Sadducees, now they would have been shocked to hear themselves described as coming under Greek influence. I'm not sure if they thought of themselves that way. But we see them adopting both Greek ideas and Greek philosophies and Greek ways of looking even at their own scriptures. We have Simon, who passes the leadership, can't call it a throne yet, down to John Hyrcanus. By this time you are beginning to call them kings. He has two sons, and Aristobulus, he becomes the high priest and king, but he imprisons his brother, actually all of his brothers and his mother, thinking that they might try to usurp his authority. And so you can see the families aren't getting along very well, even though this is a priestly family. Finally, we get to the point where the two brothers are each fighting over the throne, and meanwhile, there's a Roman general in the neighborhood. Pompey the Great had been commissioned by the Romans to clear the seas of piracy. He had done that within the space of 3 months and still had plenty of time on his rolls to do something further. And so he came to Syria, and he had been conquering there. And these two brothers, these two Maccabean, I'm going to call them by their family name, the Hasmonean brothers, both sent word to Pompey saying, will you please come and get rid of this brother of mine? And he says, oh, okay. And he comes down and he takes Jerusalem in the year 63 BC. From now on, Jerusalem And Judah will know, in fact, he actually changes the name. Instead of being called Judah, it will now be called Judea, and it will become a Roman province. So I have Judea, that part that used to be Judah. To the north there will be a separate province known as Samaria, because there's a different people group. These are folk that have intermarried with some of the resident Jewish people living there to be sort of I guess we could only call them sort of a half-breed. And then there are 10 cities to the east of the Jordan River, and the way you say that in Greek, Apollos is a city, and Deca is Latin or Greek for the idea of 10. So the Decapolis refers to the area of those 10 cities, 10 Greek cities. Now, eventually we get to the point where Pompey and who was originally his partner, Julius Caesar, they have a falling out, and they're going to plunge the Roman Empire into civil war. The Battle of Pharsalus is where this is settled in Greece. Both Caesar and Pompey, and it is Pompey, remember he's the one who had come and taken Jerusalem, and he had set up some certain arrangements, but he is defeated. He runs down to Egypt where he's put to death, and now Julius Caesar becomes virtually the ruler of the world. That's only going to last a handful of years, and then Caesar himself will be assassinated. Meanwhile, what's happened in Judea? We have a Idumean by the name of Antipater, who had been appointed first by Pompey, but now Pompey is defeated, and this is affirmed by Julius Caesar, Antipater, who's going to be the procurator. A procurator is one whose job is to procure the taxes, so we could call him a glorified tax collector, over both Judah and Samaria and the Decapolis. And Antipater takes 2 of his sons and places them in positions of authority. First, Faisal, his older son, is placed in authority over Judea, and then his younger son, by the name of Herod, is placed in authority over Galilee to the north. That lasts until about 40 BC. Now, by this time, Julius Caesar has been killed, and other things are going to take place that we'll talk about in just a moment. But the Jews revolt, and they seem to get, according to some reports, they get some help from the east. A group known as the Parthians come and help in rousting not only Antipater. Actually, Antipater's already died. Faisal is captured and killed, and Herod actually has to battle his way out. Comes down to Jerusalem, and just south of Jerusalem, about 5 miles or so, right near Bethlehem. He fights a retreating battle. He manages to escape. He gets down to Petra, and from there makes his way to Egypt, and then finally to Rome. And in Rome, he finds 2 patrons. One is Octavius, the adopted son, actually nephew of Julius Caesar, but in his will he had been adopted. So Octavius, and also one of Julius Caesar's old generals, Marcus Antonio. We know him as Mark Antony. And it's Mark Antony in particular that takes Herod under his wing. And these 2 bring Herod before the Senate of Rome, and the Senate of Rome pronounces Herod to be the new king of the Jews. However, he's a king without a kingdom. He's just been driven off by the Jews, and of course the Parthians too. So he is sent back to Israel to recapture the country of Israel for Rome and for himself, because he's going to be their new king. He will be their client king as he recaptures Israel. We'll get to Cleopatra in a bit. She and Herod had a meeting. Cleopatra always wanted to have Judah and Israel for her own possession, and at one point Mark Antony actually sounds like he's going to give it to her and make some promises to her. She really never does get her hands on it. Now, Herod the Great, as we said, 40 BC, he is pronounced king of the Jews. However, it's going to take him 3 years to get the kingdom back, so it's not until 37 BC that he actually starts to reign back in Israel, now that he's captured the kingdom back for Rome. Among other things of Herod's projects, he's going to start a number of different building projects. One of those will be the temple. Now we have a picture here of Zerubbabel's temple, after that, how it had been rebuilt after coming back into the land in the days of the Persians. It had seen some modifications in the days of the Seleucids, again some modifications in the days of the Hasmonean expansion, but Herod now takes that and he's going to vastly expand. He will vastly expand the temple into the both to the north. There's going to be a fortress that he will build. In fact, he'll name it after his client, Marcus Antonius. It's going to be called the Antonia Fortress. He will build the royal stoa in the south, here on the right-hand side of our screen, that will be known as Solomon's Porch. In fact, the Solomon's Porch area will extend completely around this area. He'll have a series of gates and bridges leading up to the Temple Mount. So he greatly expands upon that. As we said, the Antonia Fortress actually comes into play in the book of Acts later on when the Apostle Paul is arrested in the temple and brought up to the Antonia Fortress to have a hearing before the Roman centurion. There's a model that you can see of what it would have looked like in that day. So the temple was a huge affair. Notice that it had all of these surrounding walls. Now the temple itself is just that big structure right smack in the middle, but around it there were courts of the priests and of the men and courts of the women. And then there was a low boundary wall, a dividing wall that separated that from the outer areas where only where Gentiles were allowed to come. Gentiles were not allowed into the temple proper or even into any of the inner courts, but they could come to what was called the court of the Gentile around these outer courts. Herod also built the Herodium. I mentioned a battle that he fought near Bethlehem, just outside of Bethlehem. In fact, you can see it from Bethlehem. This sort of conical mountain. It looks like a volcano, but actually this is all man-made. It was a fortress back in its day. It had some huge towers, and what you're looking at in the foreground are these pillars that surround a swimming pool that Herod had constructed. So it must have been quite lavish in his day. Here's a artist's conception of how the Herodium would have looked in its heyday, where you can see one of the towers and then a cross-section of one of the others. So aerial view. Now I didn't take this picture. I've never been up in a plane over this area, but borrowed a aerial view of the Herodium looking down into it. And again, another aerial view of the big swimming pool in the Herodium. There's a number of underground tunnels. In fact, this is very common from a great many cities in the regions of Israel. The tunnels oftentimes lead to the water sources, but also they can be used as a way of escape, and treasures, different things can be found there. Quite fascinating to go not just into the area of Israel, but under the areas of Israel. Another of Herod's fortresses was the great fortress at Masada. Now this is by the shores of the Dead Sea, and the Masada itself is just a natural fortress where the wall, the mountain just goes straight up, and then there's this big level area on the top. And yet Herod takes this and he builds a great palace. Here's from the other side of Masada, where you can see the different fortifications and palace structures. Still another view of Masada. Israel did not possess any natural harbors, and so Herod had one constructed. He named it after Julius Caesar, one of his patrons, and so it was called Caesarea. There's a couple of Caesareas mentioned in the Bible. There's another Caesarea called Caesarea Philippi. That's not this place. This is Caesarea Maritimia, that is Caesarea by the ocean. And this big breakwater allowed ships to come in and be sheltered from the storms. But it was more than just a breakwater. It was a vast city. This became the seat of the government. So big breakwater on the city. To do that, he sunk great stones. Scholars are still trying to figure out exactly how he managed such a engineering feat. There is today at the ruins of Caesarea, the theater of Herod that he built there. It is still used today. They have regularly outdoor concerts that meet there, and wonderful acoustics that allow one to stand in the middle of that theater and speak, and everybody around is able to hear. There were no natural water sources, no spring waters at Caesarea, and so water had to be piped in, and it came via 3 aqueducts, bringing water from as many as 9, 10, 12 miles away. Now, it wasn't long before Herod began to have some domestic troubles. In particular, he had a number of wives, always one at a time, but one of the things he did to try to legitimize himself is he married Mariamne, the last of the Hasmonean rulers, the last of the Maccabean rulers, and had 2 sons by her. It has been said that Herod, one of his greatest mistakes was not just to marry Mariamne, but to fall in love with her. It wasn't long before he began to find plots against his throne, usually aimed at removing him and putting one of those 2 sons upon the throne. And so eventually he murdered both of his sons by Mariamne, murdered Mariamne as well. He had killed so many of his own sons that Octavius Augustus quipped, the Roman emperor quipped, "It's better to be Herod's hus than to be Herod's huios." Now it's a little, it works in Greek, not as much as in English, but what we're saying there, it's better to be Herod's pig than to be Herod's son, because Herod would observe the dietary laws, but he gobbled up his own sons. After the death of Herod, his son Archelaus, one of his surviving sons, I have to say, is on the throne for just a brief time until a petition from the Jews at Rome is so evident, and he's mismanaged things so bad that he's removed from the throne by the Romans. And from now on, Israel, at least for a number of years, will be ruled by a series of either procurators or prefects, that is, Roman governors, Roman officials. Meanwhile, another of Herod's surviving sons, Herod Antipas, is granted a tetrarchy. That is, a tetrarchy means ruler of a 4th part, and he will be over Galilee, that is the area around the Sea of Galilee, and Perea, that's the area just to the east of the Jordan River, down around the Dead Sea. He's made a tetrarch, a ruler of a 4th part, and we're told not only in Josephus, but we even read about this in the New Testament, that he has an affair with one of his nieces by the name of Herodias. Now, to get the family line, we have to go back and look at Herod the Great. As I said, Herod the Great had a number of wives. Can't put them all here; they won't fit. But we mentioned how he had married Mariamne and had the 2 sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, both of who were put to death by Herod, but they had children who survived. And so we mentioned Archelaus already, who rules for a short time before he's removed, and Antipas, Herod Antipas. They all like to call themselves Herod because he was the great. So Antipas becomes the tetrarch, and he takes up with his niece, Herodias, even though she's married to another of the sons of Herod. She is married to Philip, another son she's married to her half-brother, Philip, but she leaves her husband and she goes and takes up with Antipas, even though she's been married. In fact, she even has a daughter. And it's that affair against which John the Baptist preaches and says, it's just not right for you to have your brother's wife. And as a result, John the Baptist is arrested. And remember, he is even executed at the urging of Herodias after her daughter. Now, her daughter's not mentioned in the Bible, but her name is given in Josephus, Salome. After Salome, dances for Antipas, and Antipas says, "Well, what do you want?" And Salome, this daughter of Herodias, says, "Well, I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter." Just to continue our New Testament look, we're going to see Agrippa the First. He will be mentioned in Acts, and we see his death in Acts chapter 12. And during his time, this is a generation later, he will actually be, for a short time, king of the Jews again, where there won't be any procurators, but then he dies. His death is described in Acts chapter 12 after he had put James to death. And then after that, Israel will again be under the various procurators. So we have Antipas and Herodias. Also, we just mentioned John the Baptist. He is put to death during this period, and that's actually described in several of the Gospels. Antipater later on is going to be accused of doing some things politically incorrect. He will find himself back in Rome, and he will be questioned as to some of his actions, and in particular he has been storing up weaponry, and that sounds like he's going to revolt against Rome. I'm not sure if he was really planning on that, but he will be banished, and Herodias will go along with him in his banishment, and he will be banished to Gaul, where he disappears from the pages of history. Now, I want to talk in our closing moments about the Pharisees versus the Sadducees, because these are the two groups with whom Jesus deals quite extensively. The Pharisees, the term describes the separated ones. Remember, we described those as the Hasidim, who really didn't want anything to do with the Greek culture. They had separated themselves from that sort of those sorts of ideas. Over against the Sadducees, who, now the term means the righteous ones. I'm not sure how righteous they were, but that's at least what the name meant. The Pharisees held to the authority of the entire Old Testament as well as to the oral law, in contrast to the Sadducees, who viewed only the Torah as having great authority. They said, well, the rest of the Old Testament, those are nice books, but they don't really have that much in the way of authority over us. So they rejected some of the teachings of those other books. For example, the resurrection that's taught in Daniel chapter 12. The Sadducees had no use for that sort of teaching. The Pharisees believed in miracles, angels, immortality, these things that are mentioned all throughout the Old Testament. The Sadducees rejected miracles, angels, immortality. When you're dead, you're dead. That's very Greek in their thinking. The Pharisees believed in a future resurrection. The Sadducees denied any life after death. The Pharisees were very popular in the synagogues. That didn't mean everybody was a Pharisee. Far from it. The Pharisees were actually a fairly small group, but they had a good deal of popularity. By contrast, the Sadducees tended to rule in the temple. They were on the Supreme Court, and they had all of the big roles within the temple. Now, most Jewish people would not fit into either one of these camps. We could describe the Pharisees as the ones that were very stringent. The Sadducees, were more of a I don't want to call them a social club because that's not really fair to them. They pictured themselves as, we're the old guard, we hold to just the Torah. But in reality, most people might have been influenced by one group or the other, but the greater majority were somewhere in the middle. There were some other sects we ought to mention. We've already described the Pharisees as the separatists, the Sadducees as the liberal party. There was also the Essenes. Now, this was a very small group who they didn't think the Pharisees went far enough in their separation, so they had physically separated themselves from the rest of the Jews, and they became communal separatists. They actually go down by the shores of the Dead Sea, and they set up camp in places like Qumran, where they had their own communities. And then finally we had to mention the Zealots, again a small group, but these were the nationalists, who they said, the only way to really do good is just to get rid of Rome. We need an independent Israel, down with Rome, down with all these procurators and anybody that's friendly to Rome. And it's interesting that one of the disciples of Jesus is actually known as Simon the Zealot. So Jesus draws his disciples from a variety of religious backgrounds.